Have you ever been so fed up with someone that you wanted to throw them into a pit just to get them out of your sight? Or maybe send them along with the next passing car leaving town? I'll be telling you the story of just such a character this time on You, Me, and the Word. This time we have the story of Joseph. We are at the end of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. His father Jacob, otherwise known as Israel, had returned home with effectively 4 wives and 12 sons after 14 years. You may remember that Jacob came from a very dysfunctional family, and he kept up the tradition. He played favorites among his wives and his children, and everybody knew it. Joseph, his first son of his favorite wife, was the apple of his eye. Among other things, Jacob showed his favoritism by giving him a richly ornamented robe or coat. Have you ever heard of the coat of many colors? This is it. Naturally, with all this blatant favoritism, his brothers all hated him. Joseph didn't really help the situation. When he was 17, he had a couple of dreams that had all of his brothers and even his parents bowing down to him. Being a young man of 17, he had not yet developed what you might call tact. He just had to tell his brothers about his dreams. And as you can imagine, this made them hate him all the more. Even his father was mad at him. A little while later, most of Joseph's brothers had gone off with the livestock for better grazing, but Joseph stayed home with Dad. And then Jacob sent him off to check up on his brothers. You'd have to know that Joseph wore his special coat, and his brothers saw him from a good way off. They were not amused, to put it mildly. As they watched him approach, they actually planned to kill him. But one of his brothers persuaded them to just throw him in a dry well, in a pit. His brother Reuben, actually, and he intended to rescue Joseph later. Meanwhile, while they were having lunch, they see this caravan of traders headed their way. Instead of killing Joseph, they sell him as a slave. The traders are headed to Egypt, and they sell Joseph to a high official, Potiphar, the king of Egypt's, Pharaoh's, captain of the guard. You might think, with Joseph being such a jerk to his brothers and getting sold into slavery in Egypt, that God was against him, or at the very least didn't care about him. Quite the contrary. God was with Joseph in everything that he did. Actually, he was quite successful in his job at Potiphar's house. Soon, he rose through the ranks to be in charge of running the household. He was also a very good-looking young man, and he caught the eye of Potiphar's wife. She wanted him to sleep with her, and when he repeatedly refused, well, you might say that there was hell to pay. She falsely accused him of trying to assault her, and Joseph found himself not just as a slave, but now he was in prison. Things seemed to be going from bad to worse, but God was still with him. Over time, Joseph rose up the ranks there, and he was put in charge of more and more things at the prison, which just happened to be run by the captain of the guard, Potiphar. This is the place where Pharaoh's prisoners were kept. And one day there were a couple of prisoners there from Pharaoh's household, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. At first glance, you might not think that these were particularly important roles, but because they involved food and drink, they were extremely important and sensitive positions. This wasn't just about the look and taste of things. Poisons were often used at court to get rid of rivals or even assassinate pharaohs. So have you guessed? Both of these men have dreams while in the prison, and Joseph offers to interpret them. He says that the cupbearer would get his job back, but the baker's luck had run out. 3 days later, it all came to pass just as Joseph had said. He asked the cupbearer to speak to Pharaoh about him so that he could get out of prison, but the cupbearer forgot. 2 years later, Pharaoh had his own troubling dreams, 2 of them, and none of his own people could interpret them. Then the cupbearer remembered, and they sent for Joseph. Here's how Pharaoh described his dreams. In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river there came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. Then the lean cows, ugly cows, ate up the 7 fat cows that came up first, but even after they ate them, no one could tell that they had done so. They just looked so ugly as before. And then I woke up. And then in my other dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. So now, Pharaoh believes everything that Joseph has told him, and more than that, he puts Joseph in charge of the preparation to make sure that Egypt is ready when the famine comes. In fact, Joseph becomes the most powerful person in Egypt after Pharaoh. And he does it. He gets everything ready. It's hard. It demands a lot of sacrifice on the Egyptian people, but when the famine comes, they are ready to weather the storm. They have enough not only to feed Egypt, but also to sell to other people in other countries. Meanwhile, the famine hits Canaan, where his parents and brothers still live. Jacob, his father, hears about the grain available in Egypt, and he sends 10 of his 11 remaining sons to buy grain. He wants to keep the youngest with him because all those years ago now, his older sons told him that Joseph had been killed. So the Israelite brothers have an audience with the great leader in Egypt, the one who will decide whether they can have the grain they need. Joseph, who of course is dressed as an Egyptian official, recognizes them at once, even though they do not recognize him. Now, despite all of the greatness we have seen from him in the midst of this crisis, Joseph, back in the company of his brothers, plays some mind games with them. First, he says they must all wait in prison until one of them goes back and brings back their youngest brother, Benjamin. After a few days, he changes his mind and says, well, they can all go, but they have to leave one behind until they bring Benjamin. Joseph has their grain sacks filled and even returns their money that they used to pay for the grain. Well, the brothers notice that their money has been returned, and they're afraid that they're going to be accused of stealing. But no, they all go home, and then when they get there, Jacob absolutely refuses to let Benjamin go. He says he's already lost 2 sons now. Simeon stayed in Egypt with Joseph, so he's not risking a third. Eventually, though, the grain runs out, and they need to go back to Egypt to get some more, but they can't unless Benjamin comes with them. Eventually, Jacob relents and lets Benjamin go too, knowing they will all die if they can't get more grain. When Joseph sees them back with Benjamin, he is overcome. He has his servants prepare an elaborate meal for them, but of course, his brothers still have no idea who he is, and they are very afraid. They worry that the returned silver from before has come back to haunt them. They say to each other, he wants to attack us and overpower us and seize us as slaves and take our donkeys. I have to admit that the last part is one of my favorite lines in the Bible. It comes under the heading of, quote unquote, one of these things is not like the others. They're worried about being attacked, being forced into slavery, and losing their donkeys. While it may sound a bit funny in English, donkey is just a funny sounding word. It goes to show how important donkeys are in that kind of a rural environment. Not just then, but even today. But I digress. They went on to the dinner. Their brother Simeon was returned to them, and Joseph joined them, still presenting himself as an Egyptian official. As he saw his brothers, especially Benjamin, he was overcome again, and he had to leave the room to weep, regain his composure, and wash his face before he could return. They finished the meal, and Joseph was ready to send them on their way home with Benjamin, Simeon, and more grain. Once again, their money was returned, but Joseph did play one last trick on them. He had Benjamin framed for stealing a silver cup. The punishment? Staying in Egypt with Joseph as a slave. Well, the brothers are just beside themselves. How can they go back to their father without Benjamin? They plead with Joseph to let Benjamin go. Well, Joseph cannot continue with this charade any longer. He weeps so loudly in front of them that the people in Pharaoh's household can hear him. Then he reveals himself to his brothers. It's me, Joseph, the one you sold into slavery. Don't be angry with yourselves for doing this, because God really sent me here to save your lives and the lives of many others. And later he says, you intended it to harm me, but God intended it for good. Then Joseph, with Pharaoh's blessing, sent for his whole family in Canaan to resettle in Egypt, in the district or land of Goshen, to live out the famine. Joseph was reunited with his father, and they all lived happily ever after. Well, after the famine, which was very hard, just as hard as it was predicted, they did live happily for a while. They prospered, and they did so well, and they grew so numerous that they became a threat to the Egyptians. But I'll tell you more about that next time on You, Me, and the Word. Want to hear more? Give this video a like and subscribe to be notified about new videos. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.